Welcome back to the For All the Saints podcast, and I'm delighted to have with me the brilliant Andrea and Peter Jon, who have written this brilliant, important book called I Do, Why Marriage Still Matters. And it's, as we were discussing before we started recording, it's a really important topic to me as well. And so I'm really excited to talk about this. Thank you both for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be with you.
Let's get right into it. Is marriage actually in active decline, and if so, what factors do you think are causing that decline?
Yeah, marriage certainly is in decline if we're looking at statistics, certainly in North America, as I think it is in the UK as well. We've seen significant drop in married families in Canada for sure in the last, I would say, 30, 40 years, longer than that. But I think that's where we see the decline. Marriage still remains the most I think the most prevalent family form in Canada, and I think the U.S. as well. But certainly, we've seen the numbers go down, and at the same time, particularly in Canada, we're seeing a rise in couples living together either before marriage or outside of marriage altogether with no intention to marriage. So certainly, we are seeing trends that way. I think one of the things that has concerned us about that trend has been that decline has not been equal across sort of socioeconomic lines. We've seen marriage decline much faster among people who have lower educational attainment and lower incomes. And in the book, we kind of I think do a pretty good job of just kind of laying out the social science evidence for the advantages that come with being married. And certainly not everyone needs to get married, but we do make the argument that it's a public good. And I think this trend is particularly worrisome for individuals who are, maybe already have some disadvantages economically, and then they're going to miss out on some of the social capital, maybe some of the productive advantages that come with marriage. So that certainly is a concern. Yeah, Andrea, why do you think marriage is in decline?
Me? I was going to say I definitely think the stats bear that out, and the attitudes toward marriage. It's nice but unnecessary in the view of so many, and so shifting that into the necessary and nice category would be part of the goal of the book. We believe that marriage needs to be on the landscape of choices for young people as they consider the good life that you wish to have. It cannot be focused strictly on career choices, building a family that includes marriage, the strength of marriage. It is a sort of integral part of the good life, and we have stopped viewing it that way. And the numbers bear that out in the UK, the USA, and Canada, that the trajectory is going down for marriage and up for common law, as Peter Jon already said. So yeah.
Interesting. I totally agree with what you're saying about why people should have that choice, and we should still be teaching young people that it is a viable option. I wonder, this might be totally wrong, but we see in the last few years maybe a rise in this kind of weird phenomenon of more polyamorous relationships. And is this a contributing factor at all, or is it indicative of society's kind of evolving view of what a relationship actually is?
There's been so much about polyamory in the news, hasn't there? And
Yeah.
memoirs written about the polyamorous lifestyle and this sort of thing. And I think that is actually part of the crisis for marriage, is that we have a push for endless freedoms where marriage was actually intended to constrain. It constrains our behaviors, and that's not. We're recording this almost on Valentine's Day, and that's not going to be, a Hallmark card anytime soon. Join me in the constraint of marriage. But the realities of marriage is that constraint provides for beauty and the longevity, and the constraint of longevity, and the constraint of the number, right, of people in a relationship is certainly one of the key constraints traditionally within marriage. I mean, monogamy, we could talk actually quite a lot about, whether it's marriage or monogamy. I don't know if Peter Jon wants to jump in on that point, but really the polyamorous trend In part, you really do in the stats see an openness towards that. Um,
Mm.
in the United States, I think, and increasing it, a growing openness towards that. And then part of me wonders how much of this is really being propelled by a media fixation with the new and tempting to get eyeballs on things. But yeah, monogamy is it's a fixture of civilization, really, and to abandon that for the sort of false sense of freedom or choice within the concept of marriage, I think is wrong-headed and would show itself to be that in the research as that would happen, you know? It's too new to have had tons of studies on what polyamory does, but
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, Andrea and I have been working on family policy issues and studying families for almost 2 decades now, and I would say, like, I think she's observed something that's very true there, which is I think polyamory hits the news cycle. You'll see a bunch of, like, books or articles, and then it'll sort of disappear, then in a couple of years, it'll become kind of a popular topic again, and I think Andrea and I have both I'm speaking for you, Andrea, but we're both, have, I think, enjoyed, reading some of Rob Henderson. I don't know if that's a familiar name to you, Rob Henderson's,
Yeah, yeah, I've met him a few
yeah,
times.
yeah, excellent. So he's coined this term luxury beliefs, which are beliefs that, a certain sort of status, if you hold it, gains you status, but it turns out to be disaster if you actually try to practice it, particularly for disadvantage. And I think that's one of these. I think non-monogamy is it might be sort of trendy at a particular level, but played out, especially among disadvantaged populations, it is a real disaster. And monogamy is one of those things that it's kind of interesting. So there are, psychologists that make the case that this is actually we're pair bonding and brain chemicals and stuff like that. This is actually something that we're wired for. But even if you question that, or even if you push back against that, I think that monogamy is something that we have arrived at through civilizational trial and error. And we've realized that actually this is a pretty good way to organize a society. Monogamous societies tend to be more prosperous, more peaceful, more equal. This has generally been a good thing for humanity. So, um, yeah, I just think that that's an important and integral part of what makes marriage marriage. I think, and I think it's something that if we stretch that beyond, I think if we stretch that aspect of marriage beyond, uh, in ways that could actually very much damage the institution and render the institution sort of ineffective as a social institution. I think it is an important part of marriage, despite like you know popular books or magazine articles that we read every few years.
Yeah. So given that marriage, as you've said, is in decline as an institution, why is it still such a relevant talking point today? Is it being kept alive purely by people like me who are just random Christians who are quite, devout about that kind of stuff, or is it still kind of well in culture?
Yeah, well, we're always grateful for the random Christians who are devoted to talking about the concept. I mean, we work for a Christian think tank, and we're unabashed about that. And I think that we also recognize, even as we've written this book, which is citing a lot of secular social science research, we're realizing that you know, you cannot be unbiased by the conviction or of the culture, which is a lingering. We're post-Christian firmly in Canada anyway, I suspect also in the UK.
Yeah,
But
basically.
nonetheless, we are living out, the cultural suppositions that came from Christianity, right? Like why two people in marriage would be very much a Christian supposition of a good, a theological, but also a social good. So um, yeah, we really, I mean, I think that people in their hearts, I've made this point many times that I think the cultural the cultural moment we're living in is not the 1960s. We are not freeing ourselves from constraints. For someone my age, I think I've never lived in a world where we weren't speaking of being freed from all constraints. And so the marriage being kept alive only by like religious people, I actually think that's not the case. I think there's a hunger for the stability that marriage provides in people regardless of their faith convictions, and that's kind of the book we've written. It's not a book for people of faith, Christian or otherwise. It's a book for everyone because marriage as an institution, we firmly believe, is a public institution. It's an entry point into the good life. You're not depending on your faith convictions. So I think there's a hunger for that these days in particular.
Yeah, I think if you look at the polling data, certainly in North America, young adults and I think people in general still, I think like Andrea sort of said it nicely when she said marriage is nice but unnecessary. Like it's still sort of positive, generally positive views towards marriage. It's just one option among others, and yet I think many young adults they still want like they still want partnership, they still want long-term relationships. And so we think that like the logic of marriage has been lost. And so there's a reason to talk about the social science. There's a reason to talk about the benefits of marriage and to kind of make the case for it for people to be able to kind of choose. And really, like sort of the crux of the book is we argue that this logic has been lost in part because I think the values that we put around marriage today have changed or have shifted over the decades. So I would argue that most people probably see marriage as a private relationship for the purpose of sort of my own fulfillment, my own happiness. Um, so it's a very kind of privatized relationship. It's very much focused on self-development, self-growth, the sort of meeting my needs. And I think it's in a culture in which if my needs aren't being met, then I can kind of exit out of this, right? And so that does create uh, some instability in marriage when we have that view. And in the book, we talk about this as the soulmate view of marriage, which we borrowed from some sociologists in the U.S. And this is idea that it really is kind of a privatized relationship. It is really about um, uh, it's sort of this kind of dual sense of like I got to bring my best self into this relationship, but also this person needs to shore up the shortcomings of my own person, and this you complete me kind of sentiment. And we would describe this as the rom-com kind of view of marriage. And what
Mm.
we're arguing for is we need to kind of tilt the scale back towards institutional view of marriage. And institutions, social institutions, are really kind of this bundle of norms, of rules, kind of informal, formal, and natural rights and obligations. And there's a bit of a sense that you willingly and voluntarily choose to limit yourself in certain behaviors for the good, for the long-term benefit of you, the spouse, potential children. And so we're trying in the book, I think, to kind of recapture that and rebalance that sense and understanding of marriage. And I think Andrea is kind of right. No, she's totally right, actually, in that I think the fruit of we've been living in the sexual revolution and the shadow of the sexual revolution for long enough that the bitter fruits of that have been pretty evident, and I think there's a dissatisfaction. We were chatting with somebody last night that was suggesting, like, he's seeing this. He's a young lost dude, and he's sort of seen this in his own generation. There's like sort of this hunger for something better, and I think it's really interesting too. I was just looking at some data yesterday showing that in the U.S., young adults, the portion of young adults that are on dating apps is declining. Like, there's this sort of like
Mm.
I don't know. It's just sort of like this isn't really working, or the suspicion of like what these companies are trying to do with my data, or it's just this isn't working, right? And so I think there's a longing for something else, but there are very few places in society that will say to young adults, "Well, this is how you get there from here, from where you're at," right? And so far as religion is involved, or church, it is a community, it's an institution that can support some of that, but it doesn't have to be religion. It doesn't have to be the church. But marriage is an institution that does need the support of other institutions. It does need some sort of public support for the norms that it espouses, and in order for it to work. And I think this is why, like, the polyamory discussion is um, so interesting and so kind of like it's sort of pulling at some of those norms that I think actually are not great for marriage, right? So, but marriage does need those that sort of institutional support, and whether that happens again in religion, whether that's happening through other community institutions, I think that's helpful. But yeah,
I definitely get the feeling of this cultural zeitgeist towards kind of looking back to tradition rather than, as you say, we're seeing kind of, well, things like the end of new atheism, even the things like that, and the kind of Louise Perry's work of the showing us the failure of the sexual revolution. And we're seeing, I saw this fun data point that I brought up with someone on the podcast a while ago. I think I've brought it up a couple of times, but it was essentially showing that Gen Z had surprised the data collectors by saying that they were desperate for there to be less explicit scenes in films because they found them awkward and they preferred a traditional wholesome romance story instead. And it's just kind of, it's interesting looking at all the jigsaw piece puzzles that are kind of contributing to this overall picture that maybe, especially with Gen Z, that naturally they are kind of going back to those things. But I do wonder, this kind of profound quote that's mentioned in the book a few times, in that marriage is nice but not necessary. Just I think of my friends and I think they're not against marriage as an institution. They're not like, we're down with marriage. They're just like, there was a data point released yesterday that showed that 70% of Brits would delay marriage because of housing issues. And it's just like, it's really expensive to get married. As you say, there's a lot of red tape. Well, what would you say to those people in that situation then?
Yeah, I mean, the combined issues around economic factors and settling down, I can really relate and sympathize. But at the same time, I mean, doesn't it represent a life script that is a little bit off, right? Or if it's not off, could we raise the question of um, why not build your financial strengths together with somebody in a permanent union, which will definitely launch you, statistically in the research, at least, it will launch you into a better financial status. Why not build that life together from the starting point, even, you know, before the average age of marriage at something close to 30 these days, right? You could ask those questions. I like talking, I think the term life script encapsulates a lot of
Mm,
wisdom in the sense that we go along with the cultural norms before us. And one of those cultural norms is, in fact, at this point, delayed marriage. But it used to be that you would finish school, get married, and have kids in that order. And it was, as it turns out, it protects against poverty and other being, subject to other problems in your life later. you know, we've chosen, or actually not chosen, we've somehow fallen into this life script where you delay your partnerships. You need to find yourself completely. And you could raise the question with people concerned about housing, et cetera, legitimate concern, and then ask why not, flip how you view what a long term relationship called marriage, what that would bring to your financial prospects. But everywhere across the Western world, we're talking about housing a lot these days. Inability to find it, pay for it. It's a huge issue in Canada right now. Huge issue for fertility as well. People talk about that with regards to delaying having children. So I just question, how long can we delay everything, right? Like, delayed marriage can be marriage denied for some people, and that can mean we still, even is as traditional as it sounds, people are still interested in having a long-term stable partner, aka marriage, before they have kids, for obvious reasons, right? So, why is it that we are comfortable with delaying these fundamental aspects of the good life where we wouldn't ever say, I'm going to totally delay working, for example? I'm just not going to get a job until I'm good and ready, right? Like, we need to be asking a lot of questions about that, I think. And maybe through questions, people might see it differently.
When I used to live in Asia, when I was a Christian missionary, they had a joke in that there's a stereotype over there that people do delay marriage very far along, and they call it the 5 C's of marriage. And it was something like I'm going to try and remember a car, contract, college degree, condo, and cash. I think that was the 5 C's, and
Well
it's
done.
it's perfectly like encapsulating what you're saying, is that they want to have all of those ready before they then look at marriage. And I just think, what a shame that you're missing out on doing all of those with someone you love. That's what I love about kind of getting married at a young age. Obviously, I didn't just fall into marriage. I thought about it carefully and made sure it was the right decision for me and obviously for my wife. But yeah, it's so much more enriching to kind of build all of this together as a team rather than just kind of being a cherry on the top at the end of it.
It wouldn't be entirely new, though, for our culture to have an expectation, particularly of men, to have financial stability before marriage. So, I mean, I can see how that plays into people's consideration. It's the delaying forever aspect that really, it ends up. I mean, not forever. The stats just show marriages getting later and later, and that is, sociologists talk about cornerstone versus capstone, and Peter Jon already talked about that, but you cannot wait until your life is perfect, because it will never be perfect before getting married. Otherwise, you are missing out on the good things it can bring to you, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think, you've hit on some great points there, and yeah, the all the C's, right? Like, getting all the things in place, and it didn't used to be that way necessarily, right? We used to be more foundational. We used to, get married and then kind of build a life together, and again, yeah, I think this capstone view of marriage is if it's sort of the capstone on once you achieve all these other things, certainly leaves some people out, right? And Andrea, I think you hinted at something, really important there, that is, uh, I certainly, in Canada and particularly in the US, there seems to be great concern about sort of failing men and men struggling. And we've certainly seen like growing numbers of working age men who are not in the workforce, and not looking for work. And certainly, I think that that does also have like a contributing factor to things like marriage, right? I think although women are probably more economically self-sufficient today than maybe several decades ago, survey data would tell us women still prefer productive men, right? And so if
Mm.
there is fewer of those guys around, that also leads to delayed and denied marriage as well. So that's certainly part of the yeah, part of the issue as well, but one of the things I find, absolutely fascinating is watching, how diamond producers try to sell diamonds, particularly because they have a vested interest in young people and what they do in terms of marital decision making, and I noticed an advertisement this fall that was all about making sure, like, working on yourself, making sure you're the best version of yourself so that when finally you meet that one person, like, you're ready to commit, you're ready to and it's sort of, like you obviously you wanna be a healthy, well-adjusted individual entering any relationship, but there is this sort of sense that, like, I have to arrive. And I don't know, I'm not a young guy, and I don't think I don't feel like I've arrived yet, right? Like, if I could be waiting forever, right? And part of the, part of the thing about social institutions is they're formative, right? There's something about entering a marriage relationship that forms people and that it does change you, and we actually do see that with men. The data would show that married men tend to be a little more productive economically. Even we see with lower skilled men who get married tend to be more productive and more attachment to the labor force than men with similar skill, but are unmarried. And I hockey's a pretty big sport in Canada, and I kind of follow along. And a couple of years ago, I was reading the paper and reading a general manager talking about an up and coming player, and it was just the beginning of the season. He said, "We're expecting big things from this player." Because he got married over the summer. We think he's gonna like settle
Oh,
down,
right.
like kind of like be consistent. And it's kind of funny, but that hockey sense actually does kind of pick up on what economists have noted in terms of production. And we've often, or not often, but I have joked about doing some sort of study where we look at productivity of hockey players and marital status. But I think the point remains like marriage is formative, right? All social institutions do form us and shape us. And American sociologist David Popenow said there's few institutions that shape men outside of religion, the military, and then probably marriage, right? So there is sort of that aspect that it shapes us and grows us. Yeah.
That is a really interesting point on men because I feel like there's a lot being talked about men and the crisis of masculinity going on. And I'm interested with you both having really gone through the data surrounding this topic of marriage. Like, is this supposed crisis of men a real phenomenon that's happening that's contributing? Like, I hear that women want to date up or across, but because they're kind of advancing further and further in society with emancipation, with college education, and men are kind of retreating with their kind of education and dropping out in higher rates or whatever, that it's a lot harder to pair up? Like, is that a real thing happening? Is that contributing to the difficulty of kind of finding a partner who wants to marry a man?
Yeah, I think that is well, Peter Jon is the man in our partnership here, our authoring partnership. But what I think we've seen contributing to a demise of marriage is, um, if we could start with the sexual revolution and feminists hitch a certain brand of feminists really hitched their star to the sexual revolution and became one with it, then that ethos is the underpinnings of that are Marxist. Um, in many instances, if you look at the roots of a certain brand of feminism, um, then you see Marxism at the root. And the Marxism is in effect a social theory that divides us one from the other. Um, and so men divided from women is something to consider in the sexual revolution as a problem. Um, and then how men fare. So if we have a division that exists and we're pitted one against the other, um, then you can imagine that marriage isn't that's not a climate in which marriage thrives. Um, but I definitely think that men are struggling. We have Richard Reeves doing really important work, and by the way,
Yeah, yeah.
he doesn't agree that marriage is the sort of sine qua non of relationships. He actually would like to encourage men to be involved in their familial relationships without being married. For example, I know he has um, spoken a lot to advance men's standing in family without marriage. And so we appreciate that view and the attention that he's drawing to that issue, an important issue of how men are doing at the same time as we'd like to advocate for marriage as the thing that draws men into family life. But I don't know that you can really contest that men are doing poorly in our society today. There's just a lot of data to back that up, and we should all be concerned about it. And it's only really recently that we have been concerned about it, and I see that as nothing but positive, really, because we have gender equality acts and all of this, and that typically in the past has just been code for we're worried about women. We have programs for women. We're concerned for women's advancement. We're concerned for a lack of women in a particular domain. And I think it's finally coming around that we have some concern for how men are faring, um, and ensuring that they have that attention is paid to men's issues as well. It's so critical, really. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the data I think would suggest, as I said earlier, that women do prefer productive men for a marital partner. That doesn't necessarily mean equal or higher education. In fact, there's some evidence that portion of women, marry guys that are productive, but maybe don't have the same sort of educational level, but they're productive or whatever. So, just in general, I think, like as a general sort of overview or big kind of thing, like idle, able-bodied men, large portions of them in your society is generally not a good thing. It usually leads to bad things, and that's why they get conscripted in armies and throughout history, trying to keep young men occupied is usually a good thing for society. But I do think there is concern. I think it is a legitimate concern, not just for marriage and family, but just across the board that we're seeing men struggle.
So a big chunk of your book is the marriage advantage. I would love to learn kind of some of the highlights of this and how you propose that marriage is still an advantage to enter into. Could you share some of your kind of biggest findings and sell it to us? Not that you need to sell it to me, but
Do you want to do men then, Peter Jon, and I can talk about the marriage advantage for women?
Sure, for sure. So I think it's important to say that the advantages that are shown in the social sciences for marriage pertain to healthy marriages, and certainly not every marriage is a healthy marriage or a safe marriage, right? And so I think in the book we are pretty realistic about marriage and that it's not always healthy or safe. And Andrea just wrote an article. Kind of in praise of mediocre marriages, so even the mediocre marriage is a good thing. So for men, a little bit of what we've already talked about in terms of productivity. It does sort of focus men a bit more, tend to be more productive. Uh, marriage and parenthood seem to come together. Fatherhood seem to come together for men. It really does keep men involved in the family and involved in children in that way. So there's certainly the economic advantages, their productivity, evidence in it. Men who are married tend to take less risk, they drink less, they are less involved in substances. So, and that's not to say that women's job is to civilize men in any way, but it is something about uh, taking on these responsibilities, kind of focusing energy and focusing attention. So that's good. I think the other thing that I would point to, or the other area that I might point to, but just before I turn it over to Andrea, is there definitely is a lot of advantage that having two parents is good for kids. And that goes beyond just the economic advantage of having two potential earners. We know that kids that grow up in married parent families tend to have higher levels of educational attainment, even among lower sort of income families in neighborhoods lower income neighborhoods where there's two parents. Um, Kids tend to have higher levels of educational attainment. Less risk behavior. We've shown that actually in our own studies here in Canada that kids from married parent families tend to be at less risk for pregnancy, for um, substance use, that sort of thing, and less behavioral issues as seen in the classroom and other places as well. So there's certainly advantages. Certainly, like great kids grow up in all kinds of different homes, but there is definitely a marriage advantage for children growing up with parents, and part of that is marriage remains the most stable family form. Despite what we hear about divorce rates, some data that we had seen in Canada showed that if you were born into a married parent family, by the time you hit 10, the likelihood that your parents were still together was, like sort of 80-90%. Whereas if you were born into a cohabiting family, by the time you get 10, it was more around like 40-50% of kids were still with their mom and dad. So there is something about that marital bond that holds families together, that holds kind of parents to their children, and that has just tremendous benefits for kids.
Peter Jon, can I just come in there and ask, those data points are really interesting, and I'm wondering, obviously I assume we're all Christian, and so we have kind of this shared view of what marriage is, and the God's version of marriage. And I wonder, do those data points hold up when you go into things like homosexual marriage and things like that, or is this specifically for a traditional heterosexual marriage?
So I'm not really sure of the data outcomes for same-sex marriage. I'm just not familiar with that. Same-sex marriages tend to have there's just fewer children, and it's obviously a smaller subgroup. So sometimes data collection on that kind of thing is a bit more tricky. But I'm sure it may be out there. I'm just not familiar with it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to do a sample of outcomes for same-sex marriages because that's such a small percent. If you're doing a randomized study and you're looking at, I think it's about 1% of marriages are gay marriages in Canada, so that's a really tough
Wow.
sample size to get at. It's just a thin sliver of them, and so you want those studies to be randomized, and that's almost impossible to do
Right.
without spending a lot of money. So. Um, we have had interest in the book from people who are same-sex attracted, and they've asked all kinds of controversial questions about outcomes. The Andrew Sullivan proposition that the introduction of same-sex marriage would provide for stability within the gay community, that sort of thing. And I just told the one friend, I'm like, those are interesting questions. The studies haven't been done, and unfortunately, it remains just such a third rail that it's almost impossible to consider taking up that research.
Yeah.
Um, just has it still remains a third rail for sure.
I would have thought it would have been more than 1%. I don't know. It seems uh
It's well, for the amount of it's sort of the amount of attention that certainly in Canada
yeah,
same-sex
yeah.
received when it became legal. You definitely could have thought it was much more than that, but it's a thin percentage really. So
Right.
when we talk about those issues and trends and cultural trends pushing and pulling at marriage, I actually really don't see same-sex marriage as being a dominant one because it's more of an outcome of a soulmate culture on marriage rather than a starting point. You can definitely arrive at same-sex marriage through the soulmate model of marriage, but it's more outcome than cause. although these things are all interconnected for when we look at social trends in our view.
That's a really interesting point. And sorry I cut you off there, Peter Jon. I don't know if there was anything you wanted to share more from your standpoint of the marriage advantage before moving on to Andrea.
Yeah, maybe one thing I could just add is often comes up about like, so why is there a marriage advantage, right? And there's kind of two overall theories. One is that, well, it's just selection effect, that the kind of people that marry, maybe they are more prone to whatever this advantage is. And the other theory is, well, it's protective. Marriage offers protective. It actually does form behavior. So which one is right? And I would say there's probably a bit of both going on in most most variables that we're looking at, and maybe it depends on the variable to which degree it's more of a selection effect versus a protective effect. But we definitely are. I definitely see. We definitely do see advantages, but I think that's sort of the interplay that's going on. So.
Right.
Nothing totally simple, I think, in discussing marriage. A lot of these issues are connected to other issues, and we've written this book about the public aspects of marriage and community and the importance for community, and then of course, there's other issues, um, you know, that are involved in creating the good society that we're angling for. But in Canada, particularly, there's just marriage is absent from so many discussions. So one example would be we know very well from statistics that after divorce, income levels go down and you're at greater risk of poverty, particularly women are at greater risk of poverty in divorce. But when you come to policy discussions, we live in Ottawa, capital of Canada, tons of policy discussions going on. And you go to something and learning about income inequality, the ideas around family structure and the bearing that marriage has on income, it just simply goes unmentioned. We're hoping to raise up these points so that marriage might be included, not that it would be the dominant thing or the only thing, but just even included as a reasonable factor when you see something right before you. Like, for example, the obvious data point about being low income after a divorce, for example, the risk increasing of being low income after divorce. So that marriage advantage, I think it's like a significant chunk of the book. I sort of take it for granted that people might know about this. And then last night when we did our book event here in Ottawa, there was far more interest on that section than I thought there would be. There's even a woman who came and said, I read your book and I went to my husband and I thanked him for nagging me about taking my medicine, stuff like this. So, you have that basic thing in marriage where you're seen and loved in your good times and bad, and you're nagged into taking your medicine. Hooray! Again, another Hallmark Valentine's card. Thank you for nagging me.
I'd actually say that's one of the findings that, like in the the nearly 2 decades that we've been working on family issues, we commissioned a paper about 10 years ago, and it's on our website, called Marriage is Good for Your Health. And I was astounded. I was a literature review of just like the effects of marriage on health and health outcomes. And it's astounding, actually, the connection. Certainly there's everything from earlier detection of disease and illness to faster recovery times, better recovery times, depending on certain illnesses. So there is actually quite a bit of empirical evidence to the advantages of marriage. And we came to know a wonderful psychologist here in Ottawa who's unfortunately since passed away, but she was doing a lot of work on sort of health and recovery and attachment and that kind of things. And she had been following with another group of researchers that were looking at even just like I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was like even just human touch, and like they're sort of testing people going through, I forget, it was like certain amount of stress, and then they were like they'd have their partner come and hold their hand, and they would say, okay, like how is this changing? Whatever they were measuring, like how is this changing sort of stress levels or whatever? And she suggested to the researchers, like, I bet you might find a difference even between like cohabiting couples and married couples. And they're like, no, we're not gonna, I don't think we're gonna see a difference there. And they actually called her back and were like, you'll never guess what we found. We found actually stress level differences, like more of an advantage for those that had their married couples. So that's always kind of stuck out with me. And I'm always, it's just really interesting to see some of the empirical data on that. And this is things that don't often get talked about. certainly, yeah, I don't know particularly where young adults would like encounter this kind of information if they're not kind of reading a book or whatever. It's certainly not talked about in like sexual health classes in Canada.
No.
I we had a like a curriculum review happened in our province about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And we submitted a paper just saying, hey, you should actually talk about this long-term relationship that most young people say they want, because there was no mention of marriage in the curriculum. And the result was that I think the word marriage got added in somewhere, but there was no data or no explanation as to why
Not
someone
very
might want to get
robust.
married. Yeah, it wasn't very robust. So
Peter
um,
Jon, you should mention that Dr. Sue Johnson, who wrote Love Sense and who did all this marvelous research about heart health and
mhm.
attachment, and she's a Brit who came to Canada, so I feel like
Oh,
you
great.
Oh
now
yes.
should really promote her.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning her name. I should have mentioned Sue's name. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Anyways,
That data is so fascinating. Like, and just even that there is a stark difference between cohabiting couples and married couples. I'm guessing, is that like just down to the security that marriage brings, and like the confidence that comes from that security?
Yeah, I think so, when people enter into coveting relationships, for very different reasons, right? So for some, it is truly a replacement for marriage. It functions much like a marriage, but for many people, they sort of slide into coveting relationships. So the toothbrush sort of moves over, then the clothes, and then suddenly they're kind of living together, right? And so I think there is something about the intentionality, and there is something about like a public commitment to long-term permanency, right? And so we see this, I think, quite evidently in economic behaviors between um, cohabiting couples and married couples. So married couples are more likely to pool income and then leverage that income for long-term savings, that sort of thing.
Oh,
Tend to have higher net worth, that sort of thing. So definitely the economic behavior is a bit different, and part of that is like for some couples, like I suppose the ability to exit a cohabiting relationship is sort of the draw to it, but that does lead to greater instability. Particularly, that's still true. Like when kids enter the picture as well. So I think that stability piece is pretty key to some of the economic behavior, some of the durability, certainly the durability behavior. So the other interesting thing too is I think, and for many people this will sound counterintuitive, but um, cohabiting before marriage has actually led some academics to suggest that it's good practice for divorce. That it does increase your risk of divorce. Um,
mm,
and part of that is there's probably a number of reasons for that, but part of that too is when you combine your life with somebody else in that sort of intimate way, um, it's kind of easier to kind of maybe enter marriage than it is to like exit that relationship if it's not quite the best scenario. It's more difficult to kind of pull two lives apart and more inconvenient. And so I think people kind of settle. The other, I think, interesting thing, and this probably happens, I think every relationship is susceptible to this or whatever, but it does happen in cohabiting relationships. And there's a professor at the University of Denver, Scott Stanley, that sort of talks about the unevenness that can happen in relationships. So the person that is least committed to the relationship sort of holds the control and power of that relationship, and that the more committed person is more likely to compromise to keep that relationship going. And I think that can happen in situations where people are living together and so interdependent in that way, but there isn't that expressed permanency and permanent commitment. So that's probably at play as well. But just looking at Dr. Stanley's research.
I
right.
didn't wanna totally forget then I do think we need to just make the pitch for the marriage advantage for women, and when we're
Yes.
faced with such an onslaught of, feminist research, um, the dominant narrative in feminism is that marriage is slavery for women, and even stronger language has been used. So completely detrimental. It ruins a woman. You have all the many major feminists speaking in these terms, and so it then comes across as a bit of myth busting to say anything different. But I do think it's important to say that that marriage has the similar advantages, economically, as for men, but for women, there's, I think, a little bit more of a meandering path to the benefit, which is to say that not many feminists, some have, but not all, would be profoundly against all relationships with men. And then children are often the result of those relationships. And so feminism comes up short, this dominant narrative in feminism comes up short because it fails to provide for any form of relationship then that would actually um, work to support women and children who are in a more vulnerable position after having, children. So marriage is this institution that evolved over the long term, also for the care of children. Um, and I think that's something that, means the marriage advantage is significant and clear for women as well. And feminism does, this dominant narrative comes up short in offering anything. If they hate marriage so much, then there should be some suggestion of something else. And instead, we've just seen so many women suffering in lone parenting situations, difficult situations. We've freed men from obligation when we relinquish marriage as an important social institution. Again, it's not romantic, but marriage is a constraint and it ties families together for the purpose of raising children. And that is a definitive benefit um, for women as well. So that's some of those advantages and some of the myth busting that we have to do when faced with so much feminist disinformation from the academy. Feminism can't be spoken about without adjectives in front of it. There's so many different kinds of feminism.
Yeah.
And you have in your country, I'm a huge fan of Louise Perry and her insights, wisdom on this. And her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, has a chapter about the benefits of marriage and speaks to that. So I think those conversations are starting, and that's a good thing.
Even the most well-meaning of people in that area will still some of them will still hold the view that in the 21st century, marriage as an institution is quite archaic. And I'm wondering if, do you completely rebut that, or would you say there are kind of things that could be changed to promote a healthier version of marriage in society?
So, I mean, we mention everything in our book is short, and so everything just gets mentioned, and then people can dive in more deeply to areas they're interested in. But we don't live in a society. There's no longer any men own their wives sentiment. There's no coverture notions present in the law. No longer do women need to have a husband co-sign to get a loan, et cetera. There's a lot of movement on that. And so to suggest that marriage has today's practiced in the same way as it once was would be untrue. And so I think, the interesting part of this conversation is we're standing in favor of institutional marriage and this more robust definition of marriage. But at the same time, we also freely acknowledge that institutions do change. Major institutions change. The Roman Catholic Church has changed over the centuries. So there are changes that have been made to marriage for the better. And we are not living in a space now where those concerns still exist, I would say. And so we have opportunity in that. If it was an archaic institution, and there's much longer than an hour's podcast to discuss that, I don't think we live in those same constraints today.
Yeah, we're certainly not arguing for a return to some mythical golden age of marriage, and Andrea's absolutely right. That institutions do shift and change over time, and that there's aspects of that institution that still hold true that we think still apply to society and culture today. That's good for individuals, but also good for it's also a public good.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, I was in research for this. There was a big news story yesterday about the birth rates in China and how they had dropped significantly, and that a lot of local authorities were offering these kind of crazy incentives to couples that getting married. For example, there was a couple in Shenzhen, I think, who posed their wedding picture with a ton of cash that the local authority had given them as an incentive for getting married, and they were like, "Yeah, we got our wedding money finally." And I'm just wondering from that, are there examples you've seen of what countries are and are not doing well to kind of incentivize and promote marriage?
Why we want to raise in part this cultural discussion is that oftentimes when government and the state get involved in attempts at promoting things they once denigrated, it gets super weird super fast. So like piles of cash or have
Yeah.
a baby on a particular day and get a free fridge or these sorts of things. So we really do want to maintain this in the cultural domain and
Right.
in amongst citizens as a conversation. And the think tank we work for, Cardis, is all about promoting the institutions between government and the marketplace. And I don't know that everybody's aware that there are such things, right? That the state has become so large in Canada and so pervasive, and it's taking on so many things. Um, and so marriage needs to remain in the cultural domain. Where I think governments can do things are in preventing or removing penalties, so-called marriage penalties, barriers to marriage,
Mm.
benefits being removed if you get married, disability benefits or otherwise. Um, but yeah, this is a cultural conversation that needs to be happening amongst all of us because otherwise I might be wary of the things that government poses. Yeah, major
Yeah,
cash payouts among them, I guess.
I completely agree. I recall back to when my wife and I were trying to get married, and I was astonished at how difficult it was, and how obviously in Britain we have common law, which has many benefits, but also meant we were abiding by some kind of 15th century rules to before we could get married. And I just remember seeing my poor wife sat in the registry office with the woman who was trying to help us. Well, I say help. It seemed more of a hindrance in getting across the line, and my wife just broke down in tears, and we just had to take a few moments out, and she was just like, I didn't realize it would be so hard to get it done, and I just thought I can totally see why a lot of couples probably come in, see what they need to do to get married, and think, man, this is a lot of effort. Is it even worth it? So I love what you're talking about, and trying to get it into the cultural conversation again, and hopefully there can be some good ramifications from governments to kind of deregulate it, perhaps, and not maybe some of the crazy incentives and programs that they'll lay out to doing it. And I,
Yeah. It shouldn't
sorry,
be so hard to get married, but we've had this conversation as well, and it's a legitimate question to ask. Should the state be involved in marriage at all? Like,
hmm,
should there be any aspect of state involvement? Or rather leave it to religious communities, for example. And um, I think that's an interesting conversation to have. Um, Ultimately, when marriages break down, the government does tend to need to get involved to adjudicate the divorce and the assets. And so, you know, working towards a society in which we have less need for government to step in and courts of law to step in and say, like, these assets are going in this direction and so many minutes a week. Like, you really have a high level of state intrusion at the breakdown stage of marriage, for example. So many minutes a week will be spent with the parent X and parent Y, this sort of thing. Um, Anyways, it's difficult to envision a world in which the state is completely removed from marriage, but having that be sort of um, limited and creating an environment in which marriage can thrive without that involvement would ultimately be the goal, right? Like, marriage is the first society, families, the way in which we learn to live and be, and these sorts of, we need these institutions to be thriving if we are concerned about state involvement in our lives, and I am increasingly concerned about that.
mhm,
In the beautiful province of Quebec, has probably one of in Canada has one of the well, has I think the highest cohabitation rate of the G7 kind of countries comparatively, right? So many children are born out in cohabiting relationships, and they have just recently passed a law last year that sort of enforces like parental agreements when couples have kids together, and it's really to kind of protect children
mm,
and sort of what happens when these relationships dissolve. And it kind of got me thinking that even if you get the state out of marriage, the state still has to invent something kind of like marriage to adjudicate what happens when relationships break down, or to ensure that like children are protected. One big part of marriage is ensuring that parents are there. It is like a natural social institution or a social institution. I don't know, natural may not be the right word, but that does protect kids. And when it's sort of absent, it's interesting that we see this in real time, a state having to create something like it to offer these protections, right? Yeah, I think you could get marriage out maybe in the front end, but you would still have the state, or sorry, you could get state out of the marriage in the front end. But I think in certainly in dissolutions, the state would probably be involved.
Yeah, that is a great point. And I wonder, it's kind of a different tone of question is when you were researching for the book, were there any data points that particularly stood out to you or surprised you that you thought may not be the case, but were anything like that happen in your research process?
Hmm. A surprise result. Go ahead, Peter Jon.
Yeah, so I think we kind of knew this going into writing the book, but I would say it's something that's been an interesting development in the last few years is that we've seen significant decline in divorce in Canada, I think in the US as well. Um, so there might be some sense that marriage is stabilizing a little bit. I've sort of noticed looking at the data, the decline of marriages kind of slowed down a little bit, which I think is a good thing. The decline of divorce it's mostly a good news story, but part of that is affected by sort of aging population and just the age of people that are married. So when the married population tends to be older, they tend to probably be more stable in their unions. The other thing too is when you have fewer people getting married, that actually affects divorce rates and helps lower divorce rates. So it is a little bit of a story of fewer marriages, fewer divorces, but I think in general it's still a positive trend, and it's something that's a bit encouraging, I would say. Yeah.
Part of the motivation for writing the book was simply to put in one concise place the information that over 18 years of working on family policy in Canada, I was myself learning. And then I felt like I had changed some of my thinking on the importance of marriage and what it is and what it does. And so, in that sense, when you're putting everything together into a book that can be used as a reference to learn about the marriage advantage, for example, or as a touch point to learn about those things that have really pushed and pulled marriage and changing it in ways that we didn't really anticipate. In that sense, if that's the motivation for writing a book, then not a ton is like super surprising. But I would say I'm surprised by my own evolution in thinking on the topic of marriage because almost 20 years ago, when I applied for a job at a place called the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada, I was so hesitant about talking about marriage that I told the man who interviewed me that I would talk about um, any issue but marriage. And I just stressed again that the place I applied to work at was called the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada. And that's what I did then. I dove into other policy issues. There's tons of family policy issues,
Hmm.
childcare. It's a huge topic in Canada. So yeah, I was hesitant, very hesitant. I was reserved about marriage. I was unsure about marriage. There was a heavy dose of you have to believe this about marriage. So you weren't even allowed to talk about it in certain ways or ask questions. And that's a huge problem to remove those barriers to being able to think freely as part of the enterprise of the book and to ask questions. That's my own surprise evolution in thinking, I suppose.
Well, thank you both for that. And this has been such a fun discussion. It's such a big topic, and I really recommend the book to everyone. I'll put some links in the description. But even if you're not an avid reader, as you've said, you've condensed the information so well that this book is about 100 pages, isn't it? So it's an easy read and it's a fascinating read as well. And I think you come away well, I came away hopeful from it, especially as we discussed before, as kind of the Gen Z's possible, natural return to this in culture. So I'm excited to see what the future holds, and yeah, I appreciate you so much for putting this book together. I think it's really important, and where can people continue to follow your work and the things that you're doing?
Well, thanks for having this conversation today. And we work at Cardus, CARDUS.ca. And there are plentiful links there to get the book if you're interested or see some of the other family policies that I preferred to address, 20 years ago. Uh, lots of marriage work there. Yeah. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you both. Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.